Ladies and gentlemen, Adolf Hitler, German Chancellor, Führer, or leader of the German people, made, all on his own, the decision which transformed a limited war in Europe into a great war. And he made a second decision, again almost entirely on his own, which transformed that great European war into the Second World War. Adolf Hitler was many things. People have debated his philosophy, his geopolitics, his racialism. But in my opinion, he was essentially, fundamentally, a warlord. In the First World War, he'd risen only to the rank of Lance Corporal, but he was a very devoted soldier, acquired the Iron Cross, First Class, which is a rare distinction for an ordinary soldier, and was shattered by Germany's defeat in 1918. Everything sprang from that. What Hitler wanted to do was to bring Germany back to a great power, to undo all the effects of Germany's defeat, and then, as it were, to continue on from now a victorious Germany to make Germany the great power of Europe. He used many methods to this. He used political agitation. In 1923, indeed, he tried a political revolt which failed, and he learned from this to proceed to pervert the constitutional process. He built up a great party, the National Socialist Party, which had a constructive program of a sort. He exploited the Great Depression, and it was indeed the mass unemployment of Germany which carried him to power. But from that time, from the moment he became Chancellor, his thoughts were on the recovery of Germany. There are those who say that he wanted a great war. I would rather say that he wanted a great victory. Whether this would be achieved by war or by moral pressure or immoral pressure, I think this was unimportant to him. Curiously enough, he was not only in political matters, but in military matters, a great propagandist. He always exaggerated very greatly the military preparations that he made. In 1936, for instance, the best guesses of British intelligence were about 100% too great. In 1940, when the German army is supposed to have been overwhelming and to have defeated the French by a mass of metal, in fact, the French had more tanks than the Germans. And by 1940, again, Great Britain was producing more tanks, more aeroplanes, in fact, more of everything except rifles than Germany, and kept ahead all through the war. No, it wasn't so much that Germany had the armaments, the overwhelming armaments, but that from quite an early stage, Hitler said they had. If you look at the record before the war, as he was moving, as it were, more towards a warlike situation, he achieved his successes by overawing the other side. The Conference of Munich, the settlement of 1938, is the supreme example of this. Most of the evidence would indicate that Hitler only contemplated war in 1938 when he realized that the other side, the British and French, had already given in. And I think we can go further, though I must say other historians have disputed this. Even in 1939, when he went to war with Poland, or when Germany went to war with Poland, this was perhaps not a mistake or a miscalculation, but still not taken seriously as a war. After all, the Polish War lasted for a couple of weeks, for 3 weeks at most. The German casualties are very light. It was a war that was over almost before it had begun. And Hitler seems to have assumed that with that, the British and French, who'd done nothing to help Poland, couldn't do anything to help Poland, would fold up. Up till this time, Hitler's direction of military affairs had been remote. He was, as Chancellor, and later as as Hindenburg's successor as president, he was theoretically the supreme commander. But of course, the command, in fact, was exercised by professionals, by generals, very few of whom regarded Hitler with sincere loyalty. There was a war minister until 1938 who took all the great strategical decisions. In 1938, Hitler had a stroke of luck. The war minister, very odd thing to do, married a woman who'd had a record as a prostitute, or I suspect really only just as a nude model. At any rate, he was discredited. He was driven to resign, and no new war minister was appointed. So from that moment, Hitler was not merely the theoretical, he was the practical head of the three services. He never attempted to combine them. He always operated with each separately, kept them distinct, in a sense in rivalry, Army, Navy, Air Force. But there was still a commander-in-chief of the Army, as of the Air Force and Navy, who actually carry out the operations. It was the commander-in-chief, Rundstedt, in Poland, who decided things. It was Supreme Commander-in-Chief Brauchitsch who was responsible for the overall direction. When, in the autumn of 1939, Hitler insisted that France was not going to make peace and that there must be offensive, the generals hesitated. And at one of the meetings, a dramatic point, Hitler pointed not to the outskirts, to the Belgian coast, which is where the generals were thinking of advancing, but to the center, and said, "Why can't I go through there?" This was the origin. It was taken up by a general called Manstein, but nevertheless, this was the origin of the most brilliant strategic stroke of the Second World War. The strategic stroke which, in May 1940, disrupted entirely the French front, produced not only a defeat, but a catastrophe of the French army, which within a few weeks had collapsed, and with, I was going to say, virtually no loss to the German forces. Germany achieved not only defeat of France, but supremacy over Europe, with some 25,000 casualties, about as much as the British Army of the First World War lost on the Somme in a single day. And it was, though carried out by others, Hitler's stroke of genius which did it. It's said that he made a mistake in allowing the British Expeditionary Force to escape at Dunkirk. There was, I think, a good deal of confusion. It was not a brilliant inspiration by the warlord, certainly. On the other hand, the general in command there, Rundstedt, also hesitated. Goering said he could destroy the BEF from the air. In any case, it never crossed Hitler's mind that Great Britain would continue the war once France had been defeated. The Battle of Britain was not an inspiration of his. He took no interest in it. It's the only one of his campaigns which he never attended. He went off to Berchtesgaden because I think he suspected from the beginning that there would be no invasion. But thereafter began the development of his power. For one thing, he had proved all the German generals wrong. They had all said a total defeat of France was impossible. They had worked out their details in their old-fashioned way, and this man who'd had no experience of war except as a corporal, who had not particularly studied the great military writings of the past, by a single stroke of inspiration had achieved this staggering victory. It's often said, and it became true later on in the Second World War, that the victor in an offensive needed a 5-to-1 supremacy if he was going to carry it through. The Germans in 1940 had no such supremacy at all. They were on about a level scale with the French, and yet they destroyed what had until that time been regarded as the greatest army in Europe. From June 1940 until June 1941, except for air attacks and a minor conflict in Greece, there was peace on the continent of Europe. Hitler had achieved what no previous great man, not even Napoleon, had achieved. He had brought all Europe up to the Russian frontier under his domination. Some of the countries have been conquered. Some, though not many, of the territories have been annexed to Germany. Some of them had become satellites reluctantly. Some of them had become satellites more willingly and were cooperating. Some, Switzerland, Sweden, were technically independent, but because of their geographical position, were bound to the German economic war machine. Now, Hitler could really look over the whole of Europe and envisage it all being operated for the increasing strength and power of Germany. Germany had certainly become a great power. And there are those who speculate, why didn't he stop? As, for instance, Bismarck had known how to stop. And one answer, I suppose, is quite simple, that if you're a warlord, you don't like giving up. Hitler used other arguments. One simply was that with a great army in existence, and he didn't want to demobilize it until he'd completed his campaigns, he must do something. And there was only one place he could go. If you look at the map of Europe, English people particularly, who think in maritime terms, in terms of navy, of overseas operations, expressed surprise that Hitler never tried to invade North Africa through Spain, or even, for that matter, tried to invade the Middle East through Turkey. I think basically these were psychologically without appeal to Hitler, because they did not demand the operation of great land power, whereas Hitler was very much the man of the continent. Also, he was a man, despite his victories, full of apprehensions. By 1941, he was absolutely convinced that unless he struck a blow against Russia first and knocked the Russians out, they would one day, when perhaps his conflict with England had got more acute, they would turn against him, they would betray him. He sometimes pleaded that he needed to dominate more greatly the resources of Russia, but ironically, these were pouring into Germany until the very day that the Germans invaded Russia. And one consequence of Hitler's invasion was that the supplies were cut off. At any rate, and this is the point with which I really began, all Hitler's earlier decisions had been in part responses to others. Even say the Polish campaign was a response to the previous running argument between Poland and Germany. The French campaign was a response to the fact that France, not Germany, had declared war. But the Russians had done everything to avoid war. And Hitler alone said quite firmly, we shall invade Russia. Surprisingly enough, perhaps when you think of the alarms of the German generals in the past, this time the German generals did not oppose him. They were overwhelmed by his staggering strategical success against France and accepted he could do something the same against Russia. Moreover, like many people in the West, they grossly underrated Russia's resources, manpower, and fighting capacity. They agreed with Hitler that Russia would collapse within a month of the invasion. And the whole German invasion was conducted in such a slapdash way that when the time came in June 1941, a great deal of it wasn't ready. Slightly over half the German invading forces had to be supplied from French captured equipment because the German factories had been going along in too easy a way. You must remember that right until 1943 there was no decline whatsoever in the German standard of life. That they could manage both to win wars, so it seemed, and to enjoy all the comforts of peacetime. Again, whereas against France they had thought of detailed plans of what would happen, no defined plans were made of what they would do when they got into Russia. They were confident that they would simply break through in one place after another, the Russian armies would all surrender, in July the war would be over. Some of the expectations proved true. The Russian front did collapse. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were surrounded and surrendered. By July, it looked as if the whole front, more than the front line, but all the Soviet positions they were at the beginning of the war had been shattered. Leningrad, Moscow, and the south were all exposed to further attacks. And yet, and this is what baffled them, it was the first sign of hesitation, the Russian armies had not collapsed. And the generals met. It was the first time that Hitler had had a conference with them since the beginning of the campaign. They met in late July and discussed for about 3 weeks whether they should go for Moscow or try to encircle it. It was only late August that a great encirclement started, again great victories, hundreds of thousands of Russians surrendered, fronts collapsing, but no decision. And late in the autumn, the drive to Moscow was resumed. This was the turning point of the Second World War. In June 1941, Germany was the acknowledged victor, dominant over the whole of Europe. In December 1941, the German forces halted in front of Moscow. They were never to take it. And from that moment, so it is said, Hitler appreciated that total victory couldn't be achieved. On the other hand, he was confident that if they held on in their existing positions, they could renew the campaign the next year. Indeed, one English historian has gone so far as to describe this as Hitler's finest hour, when he and he alone breathed resolution into the wretched German troops with the horrors of the bitter winter. There was, I was going to say, an almost general collapse of the marshals and generals. The commander-in-chief collapsed. No new commander-in-chief was appointed, so that Hitler was, first of all, head of the Supreme Command. Then he was Minister of War, or had replaced the Minister of War. Now he was also Commander-in-Chief of the Army. From being, as he had been in 1939, a spectator, he was the operative chief. It was his detailed orders on the Eastern Front which ran the campaign of 1942. And although on the other fronts that came up later, let's say the Italian front in 1943 and the Western or French front in 1944, though there were commanders-in-chief there, they still received almost daily instructions from Hitler far away in the East. It was at this time he became really a recluse, settling down in an underground bunker, running the war far from the front. I think there was only one occasion when he ever went to the front, only once attempting again a public appearance, a speech to his Nazi followers in November 1943, a distant figure, but a figure, extraordinarily enough, to any outside observer, he sounds the most unattractive man, a figure who could impress people, not only make them fear, but could also inspire them. Again and again, a general faced with the problems of the front has flown to Hitler's headquarters, determined to impress the truth on him. And after half an hour has come out, uplifted and said, it's going to be all right, the Führer has said we shall win, and so we shall hold together. Hitler's stroke of 1942 was in a sense more limited than the three great offensives sweeping right across Russia of 1941. This one was to be a single drive, a drive southeast into the Caucasus and to Stalingrad. Why did Hitler choose Stalingrad? Ostensibly, you've only got to look on the map, that if the Germans captured Stalingrad, they would hamper, perhaps cut off entirely, the flow of supplies from southern Russia, and particularly from Persia, and the supplies of oil up into central Russia. I think there was something else about it. He now saw the war as a personal conflict and believed that if he could capture Stalingrad or threaten Stalingrad, the city of Stalin after all, that Stalin on his side would respond to the challenge, and rather like Verdun in the First World War, the Soviet armies would bleed to death. But the tremendous thing, of course, about the Soviet armies is that they were building up their supplies all the time. New factories were pouring things out. The German achievements in equipment were being everywhere overshadowed. Stalingrad was perhaps the decisive battle of the war, or perhaps only a preliminary. It was, at any rate, the first great disaster on the German side. And it was achieved, as it were, it was caused by exactly the same thing which, at the end of 1941, had restored the German army to its preponderant position. Once more, Hitler issued the order, stand fast. When Stalingrad was encircled, he refused to authorize the withdrawal of the Germans. This was, again, solely his decision. He believed that if he gave orders, he would make others so resolute that they would overcome impossible odds. And they failed. In January 1943, when Stalingrad held out, when the German forces surrendered, there was really the transformation that Germany was now on the defensive. Throughout 1943, the defensive was conducted in the east with great obstinacy, but it was a defensive all the time in which the scale of German losses was increasing. And when, of course, in 1944, the Allies, Western Allies, landed in northern France, then there was pressure on both sides. Some people speculate about why there was never any contemplation, consideration of a compromise peace. Some Germans attempted it. Some negotiated with the Western powers, some negotiated with the Russians. Hitler, so far as we can tell, never contemplated this. He had formed a picture. For him, although the war could never be won, on the other hand, it wasn't necessary that it should be lost. And the other great inspiration, of course, which came to him was the Japanese attack on the Americans at Pearl Harbor, which made him feel that there, over at the other end of the world, would be an ally who would stand by him. This, and for no other reason, did he plunge at the end of 1941, the very time of his disasters in Moscow, into the Japanese war. He declared war on America and thus solved President Roosevelt's greatest problem, how to get the Americans into the war. And he said at this time, Hitler said at this time, the most extraordinary remark. He said to Jodl, "We have chosen the wrong side. We ought to be the allies of the Anglo-Saxon powers. But Providence has imposed on us this world historical mistake." And in a sense, you could argue that all his campaign after the first defeats were a world historical mistake. Was there sense in it? Well, in a perverted way, yes. Hitler was confident that sooner or later, the two Western powers, England and America, and Soviet Russia, the Eastern power, would quarrel. They would quarrel territorially, because they had different outlooks. They would quarrel politically because one side was capitalistic democracy, the other side was communist, and that at a certain moment the two extremes, instead of battering away against Germany, would start bidding for German aid. Germany would be transformed from the enemy of, as it were, all the world, into the ally, the key power, which would swing the whole world situation differently. Though that right up till the end, when things were going catastrophically, Hitler could give only one order: hang on, hang on. As a strategist, indeed, you can say that he'd had great strokes of offensive genius, particularly the first, but then also in Russia up till 1941. There was this gambler's throw. There was one other gambler's throw, which is difficult to estimate. Right till the very end, Hitler believed that some new miracle weapon would be discovered, which would turn the scale. We now know, of course, that most of this was bluff, that, for instance, German scientists had not got anywhere near the atomic bomb, although they knew the methods. Later on, they were to boast they did it deliberately, but the truth is Hitler wasn't interested at that time. He thought Germany could win without it, and when he began to talk of new weapons, it was too late. He became, in the end, physically an absolutely broken man. And yet, we have these descriptions of people visiting him in the bunker in Berlin, because he'd now been, the German territory had been squeezed in, with his left arm shattered when a bomb had gone off in his meeting room in July 1944, at any rate crippled, trembling all over, dragging his feet, hardly able to speak, and yet there was the same magic effect, the inspiration with which people would come away. Generals were now reporting who commanded phantom armies, armies which didn't exist. Yet Hitler would take them into the map room, show them where this imaginary army or that imaginary army would strike against the Russians, and for a time they believed it. None of them could, or hardly any, could break loose from Hitler's magnetic personality and from the promise of victory which he held out. At the very end, he was left with the Russian forces, very little way, with, he dismissed most of his staff, kept only his most loyal followers, and lived in a fantasy where he was still sending out these messages when other German leaders, Goering for instance, hinted that, who was well away from Hitler, that he would now try and negotiate a peace, even if it was a peace of surrender. Hitler simply struck him off and ordered that he be arrested. At the very last, he came to recognize that the war had been lost, that the Western powers and Soviet Russia were not going to quarrel. And then there was an extraordinary epilogue, as it were. Hitler had been very much a man on his own. He had no confidence, he had no friends. You can read what's called his table talk. But it was, in fact, Hitler in his military train during the war, sitting around after a meal, haranguing the generals endlessly on his past, on German history, on how he'd risen to the top, on philosophic reflections. But it's quite obvious that he had no friendly connections with any of these generals or with any of the others. He treated Goering as an amusing acquaintance, but he really had absolutely no one. He was a solitary man, and he accepted, of course, sometimes advice from others, sometimes decisions. It is, I think, true, for instance, that the terrible massacre of the Jews was inspired more by Himmler than originally by Hitler, though Hitler took it up. Now, at the last moment, with only a few hours to live, he married Eva Braun, who'd been his mistress for many years, and he said, you can't have a mistress coming between a Führer and the German people. But now she got this last consolation of being his wife for a few hours. The following day, after effecting farewell, writing his testament, he and Eva Braun withdrew, and in all probability, well, it's certain, I think, that he shot her. In all probability, he shot himself, at any rate, or he may have taken poison. His body disappeared. And with this death and disappearance, Hitler performed a final service to the German people. He carried with him into obscurity the responsibility for the World War and the guilt for the crimes and atrocities with which it had been accompanied. As a result, the German people were left innocent.